The auction block in Clearwater, Texas, wasn't something most respectable women would find themselves on. But Eleanor Hartwell wasn't most women. She stood in the dusty town square on a blistering August afternoon in 1889, her dark hair pinned precisely, her green eyes fixed on something distant, a point beyond the crowd, beyond the whispers, beyond the 5 failed engagements that had left her with a reputation as damaged goods. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the rehearsed enthusiasm of a man who'd sold everything from cattle to property to desperate futures. "We have here a woman of marriageable age, proven capable in household management, educated and available for a union arrangement. She comes with a modest dowry of $2 and a warning." The crowd laughed. Eleanor didn't flinch. "This woman has been engaged 5 times. 5 times, gentlemen. All 5 engagements dissolved. Some say she's cursed. Some say no man is good enough for her. But today, we're giving one brave soul the opportunity to claim her as his own. The opening bid is $500. What the auctioneer didn't know, what nobody in Clearwater knew except Eleanor herself, was that those 5 men hadn't rejected her because she was broken. They'd rejected her because she'd rejected them first, and she'd do it again if she had to, because Eleanor Hartwell had learned something most women of her time never did: that self-respect was worth more than marriage, and a bad husband was worse than no husband at all. But she needed an escape route. She needed someone willing to buy her contract, even if just to get her out of her mother's house and away from the whispers of a small Texas town that had decided her fate before she'd ever had a chance to decide it herself. She didn't expect that someone would be James Mitchell. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James Mitchell had no business being at a marriage auction. He was 42 years old, weathered by a decade of hard work, building the Circle M Ranch into one of the most successful cattle operations in West Texas. He had money, land, and absolutely no interest in matrimony. Yet here he stood, hat in hand, watching a woman on an auction block with an expression on her face that made him pause. It wasn't resignation he saw. It wasn't desperation. It was calculation. Cold, careful calculation, as if she were sizing up every man in the crowd and finding them all wanting before they'd even opened their mouths. The first bid came quickly. A merchant from town, probably hoping to acquire both a wife and the dowry that came with her. $500, he called out. $550, came another voice. A rancher James didn't recognize. Younger, foolish-looking. The bids climbed. $600, $650, $700. Eleanor's expression didn't change. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't perform. The role of grateful woman, grateful to be claimed. Something in that stillness intrigued James, or perhaps it was the defiance in the tilt of her chin. Or perhaps he was simply bored with his own life and curious what would happen if he disrupted it. $1, he heard himself say. The crowd fell silent. That was a fortune for a wife, even a beautiful one. Even one who came with $2 in dowry. It was excessive, ridiculous, the kind of bid that suggested obsession rather than business sense. The merchant looked at James, seemed to weigh the numbers in his head, and stepped back. The other bidders did the same. Nobody wanted to match a man willing to throw away that kind of money. Eleanor's eyes finally moved. They found James in the crowd, and for just a moment something flickered across her face. Not gratitude, not relief. Curiosity, maybe. Or calculation adjusting in real time. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the tan hat for $1. The turned in oper. Crowd erupted in gossip, the kind that would spread through Clearwater by sunset. By morning, every person in town would have their own theory about who James Mitchell was, what he wanted, and why he'd paid such an exorbitant sum for a cursed woman. James didn't care. He was already wondering what he'd just done. Eleanor was brought down from the block by the auctioneer's assistant. She moved with grace, her dark blue dress catching the afternoon light. She was striking rather than traditionally pretty, her features too sharp, her eyes too assessing, her bearing too confident for the delicate femininity that was fashionable. She looked like someone who'd never apologized for taking up space in a room. "Mr. Mitchell," the auctioneer said, extending a ledger, "congratulations on your purchase. The documentation is standard, marriage contract binding for 5 years, with renewal option thereafter. The woman is yours to claim immediately or to hold at the boarding house until arrangements can be made." "I'll take her," James said. "We leave for the ranch today." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. That was the first crack in her composure. "Excuse me?" "The Circle M is 2 hours north of here," James said, turning to look at her directly. "That's where we're going. You can bring whatever personal belongings you have, or we can stop by wherever you're staying to collect your things. Either way, we're leaving within the hour. Mr. Mitchell." Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm for finalizing this arrangement, I'm not accustomed to being ordered about like a piece of furniture." "You were just sold like furniture," James pointed out. "Seems to me you're accustomed to exactly that. The difference is, I'm not interested in parading you around town, introducing you to society, or giving people something to gossip about for the next month. You wanted out of Clearwater. I'm offering you out today." He could see her calculating again, weighing options, trying to determine if he was a threat or an opportunity. Finally, she tilted her head slightly. 2 hours. Give or take. I'll need to collect my things and leave a note for my mother. Fine, you have 30 minutes. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Maybe because arguing wouldn't change anything. Maybe because even being ordered around by a stranger was better than spending another day under her mother's roof. The boarding house where Eleanor had been staying was run by a woman named Mrs. Paulson, who'd taken pity on her after the 5th engagement collapsed. It was small, respectable, and far enough from the main street that Eleanor could exist in relative privacy. She had 3 trunks of belongings. Not excessive for a woman of her station, but not sparse either. Dresses for every occasion, books, personal items, the accumulated weight of 30 years of existence. James helped her load them into the wagon he'd brought, a sturdy conveyance with a canvas cover and 2 strong horses. Eleanor wrote a quick letter to her mother, explaining the situation in the barest terms. "I've married. We're leaving Texas. Don't expect me to return." It was unkind, but then again, kindness had only ever been used as a weapon against her. The ride to the Circle M took them through country that became increasingly wild the farther they traveled from town. The landscape shifted from dusty plains to rolling grassland dotted with live oak and juniper. The sky expanded overhead, endless and unforgiving. By the time they crested a rise and the ranch came into view, Eleanor understood why James had brought her here. The Circle M sprawled across the valley like a kingdom unto itself. The main house was substantial 2 stories, painted white, with a wraparound porch that faced west toward the setting sun. A barn painted deep red, corrals and outbuildings arranged with clear purpose, cattle grazing in distant pastures, horses in paddocks. The whole operation spoke of wealth and organization and a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "This is home," James said simply. "For the next 5 years, at least. After that, we renegotiate." Eleanor looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since he'd made his ridiculous bid. He had a weathered face, the kind that came from years in the sun, dark hair going silver at the temples, a strong jaw, intelligent eyes. He wasn't handsome in the way society magazines defined handsome, but there was something compelling about him. Something that suggested competence and independence. "What exactly do you want from me, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked. "And please don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is some romantic gesture." James smiled slightly. "I want a wife in name. Someone to manage the household, to handle the business aspects of running the ranch that I don't have time for, to be pleasant company at dinner. I want 5 years of partnership, without the expectation of emotional dependency. After 5 years, we re-evaluate. If you're miserable, I'll help you disappear somewhere you can build a real life. If you're content, we can renegotiate. I'm not interested in owning you, Miss Hartwell. I'm interested in solving a mutual problem. And what problem am I solving for myself?" Eleanor asked. "Freedom," James said. "Distance from your mother. Distance from the women who've spent the last year telling you you're damaged goods. Distance from a town that's decided your story for you. Out here, you get to decide your own story. Or at least, you get to live without an audience judging every word you speak." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was honest, and Eleanor had learned to value honesty above almost everything else. "What about the other part?" she asked carefully. "The marital part, the physical expectations." James was quiet for a moment. "I'm not interested in forcing you into anything you don't want. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't find you attractive. If there's attraction on your end, we can explore that. If not, we'll coexist like business partners with a shared living space. Your body is yours. That's not negotiable." Eleanor had never heard a man say those words before. In her 5 failed engagements, there had always been an assumption of what she owed, what she was expected to provide, what her body was for. The lack of that assumption now was almost disorienting. "I need to think about this," she said. "You can think about it on the porch," James said. "But I'm not taking you back to Clearwater. That chapter's closed. Everything from here on is new." He wasn't wrong. Eleanor had burned her bridges when she stepped onto that auction block, admitted to the whole town that she'd rather be sold than stay. There was no going back. There was only forward, into this strange arrangement with a stranger who'd paid far too much money to buy her contract. "Show me the house," she said finally. The interior of the Circle M was surprisingly refined. Not fancy. James clearly wasn't the type to care about velvet and crystal, but well organized and comfortable. High ceilings, large windows, a massive kitchen with a cast-iron stove that looked like it could feed an army. The furniture was solid and unpretentious. Books lined the shelves in what appeared to be the study. "The West Wing is for you," James said. "Bedroom, sitting room, dressing room. Anything you want changed, we can change. The kitchen, dining room, and main sitting area are shared. The East Wing is my space. We can establish whatever boundaries feel right." "Do you have staff?" Eleanor asked. "A housekeeper named Mrs. Grace, who comes 3 days a week. A cook named Samuel, who lives in the bunkhouse. Ranch hands for the outside work. You'll be expected to manage the household staff, coordinate meals, handle the accounts that relate to the domestic side of things. I handle the cattle, the land, the business operations. You handle everything else." It was a clear delineation, professional, separate, everything Eleanor had learned she needed to survive. "And if I fail at this?" she asked. "You won't," James said. "I wouldn't have paid $1 for someone incapable of managing a household. Besides, the worst that happens is we go our separate ways in 5 years, and you're 5 years older, with money in your pocket and your independence intact. You can't lose, Miss Hartwell. You can only win or break even." Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at the land, stretching toward the horizon. In Clearwater, she'd been a failure, a woman too picky, too opinionated, too unwilling to accept what society offered. Here, With the weight of a small Texas town's judgment finally behind her, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The sense that her story wasn't over, just turning a new page. "Call me Eleanor," she said without turning around. "We're going to be living together." Miss Hartwell seems unnecessarily formal. "James," he said, "and welcome to the Circle M, Eleanor." That night, Eleanor stood in her new bedroom, still sparse, still not quite hers, and tried to comprehend the strangeness of her new life. 2 hours ago, she'd been standing on an auction block, the object of speculation and pity. Now she was the wife of a man she'd just met, with a contract guaranteeing her freedom and independence. She'd been called cursed for wanting standards, damaged for refusing to settle, difficult for having opinions. But standing in this house, on this ranch, far from the voices that had tried to define her, Eleanor wondered if, maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about what she wanted all along. Maybe she hadn't needed a husband. Maybe she'd needed exactly this, a partner who didn't need her to be anything except competent, honest, and willing to do her part. She fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the Texas scrubland, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first morning at the Circle M, Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and roosters announcing the arrival of day. The bed was comfortable, the room was hers, and for the first time in years, she didn't hear her mother's voice before she'd even opened her eyes. She dressed in one of her practical morning gowns, dark green cotton with minimal decoration, and ventured out to explore the main part of the house. The kitchen was already bustling. A man she presumed to be Samuel, the cook, was working at the stove with practiced efficiency. He was in his 50s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who took his work seriously. "Morning, ma'am," he said, without turning around. "Coffee's fresh. Breakfast won't be ready for another 30 minutes. Mr. Mitchell usually takes his in the dining room at 6. "Thank you, Samuel. I'll have coffee here if that's all right. And please, call me Eleanor." Samuel nodded, already knowing better than to make assumptions. "Will you be wanting to discuss menus with me, Ma'am Eleanor?" It was a good question. In her mother's house, Eleanor had never been given authority over anything as fundamental as food. That had been her mother's domain, wielded as a weapon to keep everyone dependent and obedient. Here, it seemed, she actually had responsibility. "I'd like to learn how you currently operate," Eleanor said carefully. "What we're budgeting for, what the household typically eats, what supplies we have access to. Then we can make adjustments together if needed." Something in Samuel's expression softened. "Yes, ma'am, that sounds fair." By the time James appeared in the dining room at 6, Eleanor had already spent 2 hours with Samuel learning the rhythms of the prans, kitchen, the inventory of the pantry, and the weekly shopping schedule. She'd also discovered that the household accounts were chaotic, scattered between 3 different people with no clear system. "Morning," James said, sitting down across from her. Samuel placed a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits in front of him. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Eleanor said. "I've been speaking with Samuel about the household operations. I have some thoughts about streamlining the kitchen management and the supply ordering, but I wanted to understand your preferences first." James looked up from his eggs. "My preferences? Food preferences, daily schedule, what you expect from the household. It would be helpful to know your expectations before I implement changes." He studied her for a moment. "I expect clean clothes, hot meals, and a house that doesn't fall into disrepair. Beyond that, you have my blessing to run things however you see fit. I don't micromanage." It was refreshingly simpler. Eleanor had expected more demands about how things should be done, opinions about every decision, the kind of controlling behavior she'd witnessed in the homes of her mother's friends. James seemed content to let her have authority. "I'll need access to the household accounts," she said. Talk to my foreman, Calvin. He handles all the money. I'll tell him you have my authority. Eleanor nodded and returned to her breakfast, but her mind was already working through what she'd observed. The household was functioning, but inefficiently. Food was being ordered in excess. The linens weren't being properly rotated, which meant more work for the laundress. The pantry organization was haphazard. These were things she could fix, things that would prove her value beyond simply existing as a wife. After James left to oversee the morning ranch work, Eleanor set about exploring the rest of the house more thoroughly. The west wing, her space, was nicely furnished but impersonal. The east wing, which she wasn't invited to but briefly glimpsed, was similarly spare. The study contained an impressive library. The main sitting room had good bones but felt unused. She was measuring the sitting room windows, thinking about curtains, when Mrs. Grace arrived. The housekeeper was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with grey hair pinned back severely and an expression that suggested she'd seen enough of life to be unshockable. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell," she said. "I'm Mrs. Grace. Been keeping this house for Mr. Mitchell for near about 6 years now." Eleanor extended her hand. "Eleanor, and it's lovely to meet you. I wonder if you might have time this morning to discuss the household operations. I have some thoughts about how we might improve efficiency." Mrs. Grace's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, she wasn't accustomed to being consulted. "Well, that's sure. We could sit in the kitchen." Over coffee, Eleanor learned more about the household than James or Samuel had been able to tell her. Mrs. Grace mentioned that the linens were handled by a woman named Ruth, who came once a week, that the meals had been somewhat inconsistent before Samuel was hired 2 years ago, and that Mr. Mitchell rarely complained, but also seemed to prefer things that required minimal effort or attention. "He's a fair man," Mrs. Grace said carefully, "but he keeps himself separate. Lost someone once, I think. Before my time, but the ranch hands talk. Some woman years back. He doesn't let people get close anymore." Eleanor filed this information away. She wasn't here to get close to James, but understanding his history might help her navigate the dynamics of this strange arrangement they'd entered into. "I'd like to make some changes," Eleanor said. "Nothing dramatic. But I want to establish better systems for the household accounts, the supply ordering, and the maintenance schedule. I'd like your help with that, Mrs. Grace, if you're willing." "I'm willing," the older woman said, "but folks might talk, might say you're stepping outside your place." "People have been talking about me since I arrived," Eleanor said calmly. "My mother spent an entire year in Clearwater explaining my failures to anyone who would listen. I've learned that the alternative to people talking about you is being ignored, and I'd rather be talked about than erased." Mrs. Grace smiled then, a real smile that transformed her stern face. "Fair point. I'll help however you need." By the end of the week, Eleanor had implemented 3 significant changes. A new system for ordering supplies that accounted for seasonal availability and actual consumption rates, a rotation schedule for linens that Mrs. Grace helped her coordinate with Ruth, and a simplified accounting method that she maintained in a leather-bound journal she'd found in the study. She'd also discovered, quite by accident, that the main sitting room would be perfect for a proper library. The study was functional, but the sitting room had better light and would be more conducive to actual use. She spent an evening reorganizing the books, sorting them by subject and author instead of random placement, and arranging the furniture to create comfortable reading spaces. James found her there on Saturday evening, surrounded by stacks of books and a notepad full of plans. "What's all this?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than disapproving. "The study felt like a waste of a good room," Eleanor said. "I thought the library might be better utilized here, where the light is better and the space feels more inviting. If you'd prefer the books remain in the study, I can move them back." "No, this is." James looked around at the transformation. "This is good, better than it was. Did you do all this yourself?" "Mrs. Grace helped," Eleanor said, and Samuel lent his strength when things needed moving. "Why?" James asked. Eleanor set down her notepad. "Because I'm here for 5 years. Because doing nothing would drive me mad. Because this house was functioning, but it wasn't being lived in. It felt like a place someone visited, not a place someone inhabited." James picked up one of the books, a volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked. "Someone grateful, someone trying to prove her worth by being invisible and accommodating. Someone playing at being a wife." He looked at her. "You're actually trying to build something here. You're making decisions about how things should be, and you're making them well." "I was raised to believe that a woman's only value was in service to a man," Eleanor said. "My 5 failed engagements weren't actually failures at all. They were me refusing to accept that definition. I wanted to marry a man who valued me for my mind, not just my ability to bear children and manage a household. That's why." The others ended. James was quiet for a moment. "And do you think you found that here?" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that I've found a situation where I can prove my worth to myself, regardless of what anyone else thinks. That's perhaps more important than anything else." "Fair enough," James said. He set the book down. "The house looks nice, really nice. You're welcome to continue making changes as you see fit. This is your space now, too." That night, Eleanor sat in the reorganized library, reading by lamplight, and felt something shift in how she thought about the Circle M. It wasn't just a place she'd been brought to escape her mother and the judgment of Clearwater. It was becoming a place where she could actually build something, create something, prove that the woman everyone had called cursed was actually capable, competent, and worthy of respect. She was beginning to understand why James had bid $1 for her. It wasn't about desire or romance. It was about recognizing in her someone who wouldn't be satisfied with half measures, someone who would actually improve his life, because she refused to do things poorly. And perhaps, she thought, that was a better foundation for marriage than love ever could be. The following week brought the first real test of their arrangement. A drought had been threatening the region for months, and it finally arrived. The grass in the pastures began to dry, water sources were becoming unreliable, and the mood among the ranch hands shifted from routine competence to quiet concern. Eleanor overheard conversations at dinner about rotating cattle between pastures, about potentially needing to sell off part of the herd early, about the cost of bringing in water if the drought continued. After Samuel cleared the plates, she spoke. "James, I've been listening to the conversations about the drought. I wonder if I might be helpful in some way. I'm not a rancher, but I have some experience with resource management." James looked at her with surprise. "This isn't your concern, Eleanor. Everything that affects the stability of this household is my concern," she said firmly. "If the ranch fails, I fail with it. Besides, an outside perspective sometimes helps. At the very least, I can listen." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right. Come to the study after breakfast tomorrow. We're meeting with Calvin and the foreman to discuss strategy." Eleanor showed up the next morning with her notepad and settled into a corner of the study, listening as James, Calvin, and the foreman, a man named Robert, discussed the drought situation. What she heard was a group of men so focused on the immediate problem that they were missing longer-term solutions. They were talking about selling cattle now to preserve water, but Eleanor could see that the real issue was that their water sources were unreliable and had been for years. They'd simply never had to face the full impact until now. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, she spoke carefully. "What if the problem isn't the drought, but your infrastructure? You're being reactive instead of proactive. If you're going to survive another drought, and you will, this is Texas, you need a system that works regardless of weather conditions." Robert looked skeptical. "And how exactly do you propose we do that, ma'am?" "You invest in wells," Eleanor said. "Multiple wells across different parts of the ranch, so you're not dependent on surface water. You implement a rotation system that maximizes water use efficiency. You create storage systems, tanks to capture water when you have it and preserve it for when you don't. That costs money, Robert said dismissively. So does selling off half your herd, Eleanor countered. And selling your herd in a drought means selling at reduced prices because everyone else is doing the same thing. By the time the drought ends, you'll have fewer resources to rebuild. Investing in wells and infrastructure costs money now, but it protects your profit margins for years. James was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Calvin was actually nodding slowly, doing mental calculations. "She's not wrong," Calvin said. "It's a bigger initial investment, but the long-term math works out." Robert still looked unconvinced, but James stood. "We'll look into the costs of drilling wells. Eleanor, thank you for that perspective. We'll do some planning and get back to you with what we find." That evening after dinner, James found Eleanor in the library. "That suggestion you made," he said, "about the wells, where did that come from?" "My grandmother's family owned property in Pennsylvania," Eleanor said. "During a particularly dry season, they almost lost everything because they relied on one water source. They spent what money they had investing in alternative water systems, and it saved them. I remembered the lessons from that." "You're more interesting than I expected," James said. Eleanor looked up from her book. "Observation," he said, "and yes, it's a compliment. Most women would have stayed out of ranch business entirely. You walked into it like you belonged there." "I do belong there," Eleanor said simply. "I'm part of this operation now. That means everything that affects it affects me." He nodded and left, but Eleanor had the sense that something had shifted between them. Not romantically, she still had no expectation of that, and didn't particularly want it, but something deeper. A recognition that she was more than a wife in name, more than someone he'd bought to solve a problem. She was becoming a partner. The well drilling operation began 3 weeks into Eleanor's tenure at the Circle M. 3 drilling teams had been hired from a company in Fort Worth, and the noise of their equipment echoed across the ranch from dawn until dusk. The first well site had been chosen by Eleanor and James to gather a location that would serve the northern pastures where the most valuable cattle were, currently grazing. Eleanor had expected the project to be straightforward. Hire the drillers, drill the wells, celebrate when water was found. She hadn't anticipated the complications. The first well came in at 300 feet, and the water quality was poor. The water was brackish, alkaline, unsuitable for cattle. The drilling company assured them this was temporary. Better water would come with deeper drilling, but deeper drilling meant more expense and more time. Robert was vindicated in his skepticism. He spent the better part of a morning in the ranch office, clearly waiting to say, "I told you so," to James. Eleanor was there, reviewing the drilling company's reports when Robert arrived. "Well's no good," he said without preamble. "We should stop now, cut our losses. Bad water's worse than no water in some ways. Cattle won't drink it, or they drink it and it makes them sick." "We drill deeper," Eleanor said, not looking up from the reports. "With what money?" Robert asked, sharply. "We're already committed to 3 wells. The first one's already cost us more than expected. If we keep throwing money into deep drilling, we won't have capital for the rest of the operation." Eleanor finally looked at him. "How long have you worked here, Robert?" 7 years, he said. "And in those 7 years, have there been dry periods?" "Sure, every few years." "And what happened when there were dry periods before we started this project?" Robert's jaw tightened. "Lost cattle. Had to sell off stock early. Wasn't ideal, but it's how things go." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "That's not how things go. That's how things went, because you had no alternative. We're creating an alternative. The first well was a test. It gave us information. Now we use that information to succeed with the second well instead of failing with 3 identical wells." "You're not a driller," Robert said. "No, I'm not," Eleanor agreed. "But I can read reports. The drilling company noted that the Quality improved at 250 feet in the test bore they ran before we hired them. They recommended drilling to at least 400 feet for our soil composition. We're at 300. We need to go to at least 375 before we conclude this well is worthless. And if it's still no good at 375, then we've spent the money and learned we need to drill deeper for the next well. Science requires experimentation, Robert. You work with cattle breeding, you understand that you don't always get results on the first try. This is the same principle. Robert wasn't happy, but Eleanor could see the logic landing. He nodded slowly. I'll tell the drilling company to go deeper. James appeared in the office doorway as Robert was leaving. He'd clearly heard at least part of the conversation. You're spending money I didn't authorize, he said, but his tone wasn't angry. It was almost amused. I'm spending money that will prevent us from losing 10 times as much if this drought continues and we have no water infrastructure, Eleanor said. If you want me out of the business decisions, tell me now, and I'll confine myself to household matters. I don't want you out of the decisions, James said. I want you to tell me what you're committing us to before you commit us to it. Fair enough, Eleanor said. We're drilling the first well to at least 375 feet. It'll cost another $800. The drilling company believes we'll find adequate water at that depth. If we don't, we'll have information for the remaining 2 wells. Do it, James said. And Eleanor, you're right about Robert. He thinks in the short term because he's always had to. You're thinking in the long term, and that's what this ranch needs. The deeper drilling began the following day. Eleanor found herself checking on the drilling site multiple times daily, watching the progress, asking questions of the drillers about their findings. She started keeping detailed notes about every foot of drilling, every layer of earth brought up, every indication of water quality. On the 4th day of deeper drilling, at 360 feet, the color of the soil changed. The drillers extracted samples showing increased moisture content and fresher-looking earth. Eleanor's heart jumped. By 370 feet, water began flowing. Clear water, fresh water, water that smelled and looked clean. The drillers tested it, and their faces confirmed what Eleanor could already see. This was good water. This was what they'd needed. She sent a ranch hand to find James, who was working on fence repairs in the western pasture. When he arrived, water was still flowing from the wellhead, and Eleanor was standing beside it with dirt on her skirt and an expression of pure triumph. "We found water," she said simply. James walked to the wellhead and examined the flow. He picked up a handful of the water and drank it, tasting it carefully. Then he looked at Eleanor. "You did this," he said. "The drilling company did the work," Eleanor said. "But yes, I pushed for going deeper. I was right to push." "You were," James agreed. He stood there for a moment, looking at her, actually looking at her, not just observing her. "Do you know what I realized when Robert was arguing against going deeper?" "What?" "That you're not afraid to be wrong. Most people are terrified of being wrong, so they defend their initial position even when evidence suggests they should change. You made a decision, you defended it with logic, but you would have accepted it if the evidence hadn't supported it. That's rare." Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond to that. "I learned a long time ago that being right about my decisions isn't as important as making the best decision possible with the information I have. In clear water, I was told I was difficult because I wouldn't marry men who weren't right for me. But I wasn't being difficult, I was being accurate. I knew those men wouldn't make me happy, and I said so. Everyone called it obstinacy. I called it self-respect. Those 5 men were fools," James said quietly. "They were the men my mother selected for me," Eleanor said. "They were acceptable by society's standards. But I didn't want acceptable. I wanted right." James reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped Eleanor's pins behind her ear. It was an intimate gesture, one that surprised them both. Well, you're right to be here, he said. At the Circle M, with me. Eleanor stepped back slightly, needing distance to think clearly. They'd established parameters as business partners, not lovers. She wasn't sure what that gesture meant. The water is good, she said, redirecting. We should move forward with the second well immediately. All right, James said, understanding her retreat. We'll start tomorrow. The second well took less time to complete successfully, armed with the knowledge from the first well that they needed to drill to at least 370 feet to reach good water. The drilling company was able to plan more efficiently. The second well came in producing clean water 6 feet deeper than the first, and with even better flow. The third well was more challenging. The drilling company hit a layer of stone at 280 feet that required different drilling techniques. It took an extra week and an additional $600 to get through. But when they reached 400 feet, the water that came up was the cleanest and most abundant of all 3 wells. By the time the third well was completed, the drought had worsened. Dust storms rolled across the landscape. The pastures that had been green were turning brown. Cattle from neighboring ranches were dying of dehydration, and their desperate owners were selling off herds at catastrophic prices. But the Circle M cattle had water. Not unlimited water, but reliable water from 3 different sources spread across different parts of the ranch. James was able to manage his herd carefully, rotating cattle between pastures, maintaining them through the drought without the kind of losses that were devastating other ranches. More importantly, he wasn't forced to sell at depressed prices. When the drought finally broke 6 weeks later, a storm system moving up from the south, bringing 2 weeks of steady rain, his herd was intact and healthy. Eleanor was in the kitchen with Samuel when James found her, his boots and clothes soaked through from the rain. "Come outside," he said without explanation. They stood on the porch together, watching the rain fall and the land come alive with water and possibility. The dust was settling. The grass would begin to grow again. The water tanks James had instructed Calvin to build alongside the wells were full. "We'll make it," Eleanor said. "We'll get through to next year stronger than we started." "We will," James agreed. "Because of you. Because you pushed me to think differently about how to solve this problem." "It wasn't just me," Eleanor said. "It was you, and Robert, and Calvin, and Samuel, and all the ranch hands who worked the operation. But yes, I was right about the wells." James smiled. "You have no modesty at all, do you?" "Why would I?" Eleanor asked, turning to look at him. "I spent 30 years being told I was wrong, broken, damaged, because I had standards. I'm not going to spend the next 5 years pretending to be less capable than I am. I'm good at what I do. The wells were a good solution. I'm allowed to acknowledge that." "You are," James said, "and I'm grateful for it." More than grateful, actually. He reached out and took her hand. This time, Eleanor didn't step back. "I hired you to solve a problem," James continued. "To manage the household and give me a wife, in name for business purposes. But you've become something more than that. You've become integral to how I think about this place, this operation, my future. And I'm wondering if maybe that was always meant to happen." Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest, something she'd carefully suppressed since arriving at the Circle M. Attraction, connection, the possibility that this convenient arrangement might become something deeper. "James," she said carefully, "we have 5 years on this contract. I came here to escape being defined by what I couldn't give a man. I'm not sure I'm ready to be defined by what a man needs from me again." "I'm not asking you to be defined by me," James said. "I'm asking if you might want to continue after the 5 years are up, not because the contract requires it, but because you choose to. That's different from what happened in Clearwater. That's genuine choice." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at the rain falling around them, at the land she'd helped save from ruin. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "I need time to understand what I actually want, separate from what's convenient or pragmatic. Take All the time you need, James said. The Wells aren't going anywhere. Neither am I. 3 months after the Wells came in successfully, Eleanor had settled into a rhythm at the Circle M that felt almost natural. She managed the household with efficiency, consulted on ranch decisions when James asked for her input, and spent her evenings in the library reading or working on long-term household improvement plans. She'd also begun to realize that her feelings for James had shifted. What had started as respect and intellectual compatibility was deepening into something more complex. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments. She noticed the way he moved when he came in from working. She anticipated his preferences at dinner. She caught herself actually looking forward to their conversations in the study. It terrified her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, brought by the postal rider who came through once a week. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her mother. She didn't open it until she was alone in the library that evening. The letter was long, 3 pages, and filled with information Eleanor had not asked for and did not want. "My dear Eleanor," it began, "I hope you are well and that you have finally found your place in the world, misguided though your choices have been." Eleanor skipped ahead, her stomach already tight with anxiety about what revelations were coming. "I have been approached by a gentleman named Mr. Edward Vance. He is the brother of your former fiancé, William, whom you so foolishly rejected. Mr. Vance has informed me that William has never recovered from your rejection. He has become withdrawn, refuses suitable marriages, and has developed what the doctors are calling a nervous condition." Eleanor's breath caught. "Mr. Vance believes that if you were to write to William, expressing regret for your actions and indicating that you made a mistake in ending the engagement, it might help him recover. He is willing to pay a sum of $500 to facilitate this reconciliation. This seems to me a reasonable request, given the damage you have caused." The letter continued with guilt, manipulation, and carefully worded suggestions that Eleanor had ruined William's life through her selfishness. It ended with her mother's signature and a postscript. "Mr. Vance will be arriving in Fort Worth next month. He wishes to discuss this matter with you personally." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each time her anger growing colder and more focused. She didn't tell James about it immediately. Instead, she spent the next 2 days thinking, planning, and gathering her own information. She wrote letters to 2 acquaintances from Clearwater, asking carefully phrased questions about William and his condition. The responses came back within the week: 1 from a minister's wife who'd attended the same church, 1 from the wife of a banker who'd known the family. Both letters indicated that William was fine, perfectly fine. In fact, he'd become engaged to another woman 6 months after Eleanor had ended their engagement. He was currently living in Austin with his new wife and had become involved in land development investments. Eleanor took this information and sat down in the study to wait for James. He arrived at his usual time, covered in dust from the day's work, ready to review the evening's business before dinner. She handed him the letters without preamble. "My mother," Eleanor said quietly, "and apparently a man named Edward Vance are trying to manipulate me into writing a letter expressing regret to my former fiancé. They're claiming he's devastated and ill from my rejection. They've offered my mother $500 for my participation in this fabrication." James read through the letters, his expression growing darker with each word. When he finished, he set them down carefully. "Is any of it true?" he asked. "No," Eleanor said. "I had 2 people confirm that William is engaged, living in Austin, and doing quite well. He's not devastated. He's not ill. This is manipulation, pure and simple. My mother wants money, and this Vance person, whoever he is providing her with a way to get it." "What do you want to do about it?" James asked. Eleanor had prepared for this question. "I want to write a response to both my mother and this Vance person. I want to make clear that I will not be manipulated, that I will not participate in fabricating regret for decisions I made correctly, and that I consider this attempt to coerce me morally reprehensible. I want you to know what I'm doing in case there are consequences. James leaned back in his chair. Your mother will likely respond with anger or guilt manipulation. She may threaten to cut you off financially or socially. She may spread rumors in Clearwater about you. She may attempt to involve legal authorities in some way, though I don't see a legal basis for her claims. I know, Eleanor said, but I can't live under the threat of my mother's manipulation indefinitely. At some point, I have to draw a line and accept the consequences. Then draw it, James said firmly. Write your letter. I'll have Calvin review it for any legal vulnerabilities before you send it. And Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever happens, you have protection here. This ranch, this position, it's secure. Your mother can't touch it. Eleanor felt something release in her chest. In Clearwater, she'd been alone in her refusal to bend. Here, she had someone standing beside her. She spent the evening drafting the letter. It was firm, but not unkind. She explained clearly that William was not devastated, that she had made the correct decision in ending their engagement, and that she would not participate in emotional manipulation or fraud. She made clear that any further attempts to coerce her would result in her cessation of all contact with her mother and potential involvement of legal authorities if her name was being used fraudulently. She sent it the following day via registered mail, ensuring there would be proof of delivery and content. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Eleanor began to believe the matter had been resolved. Her mother would accept that she was no longer available for manipulation, and that would be the end of it. Then Edward Vance arrived at the Circle M. He came in a fine carriage, dressed impeccably, with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Calvin informed Eleanor that he'd requested an audience with James, claiming to have important business to discuss regarding Eleanor. Eleanor was in the kitchen when James came to find her. "We have a visitor," he said quietly. "Edward Vance. He's in the study. He's asking to speak with you." "What did you tell him?" Eleanor asked. "That you're busy, but I'd be happy to discuss whatever he's come about on your behalf. He insisted on speaking with you directly." Eleanor removed her apron and made her way to the study, where Edward Vance rose from the chair to greet her with a kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Hartwell," he said, extending his hand. "Forgive the intrusion. I've traveled a considerable distance to speak with you personally." Eleanor did not take his hand. "Mr. Vance, I received correspondence regarding your proposal. I responded in writing. I'm not sure what additional discussion is necessary." Vance's smile tightened. "Your response was somewhat harsh. I was hoping we might discuss this matter more reasonably." "There is nothing to discuss," Eleanor said. "I will not fabricate regret for accurate decisions. I will not participate in schemes to manipulate my former fiancé or my mother. I will not accept money in exchange for my integrity. You should return to wherever you came from." "I see," Vance said carefully. He settled back into the chair, clearly not ready to leave. "Your mother indicated you might be difficult. She suggested that perhaps your husband might be persuaded where you are not, that he might understand the value of family cooperation." Eleanor felt rage spike through her. "My husband is not a tool for your manipulation either. And my mother overstepped significantly by indicating any such thing. Mr. Vance, you have worn out my patience." "James, I believe our guest was leaving." James had been standing silently in the doorway. Now he stepped fully into the room. "The lady asked you to leave," James said, his voice perfectly pleasant, but with an edge underneath. That made it clear this was not a request. "I'd advise you to take her suggestion." Vance looked between them, calculating. Finally, he stood. "This isn't finished, Miss Hartwell. Your mother is a client of mine, and I have an obligation to her. You may not participate willingly, but there are other avenues. If you attempt to use my name or image in any way without consent, I will pursue legal action," Eleanor said coldly. "I have friends in Austin and Fort Worth with resources. I will make your fraud prosecution expensive and public. I suggest you abandon this scheme entirely. It was a bluff, but it was delivered with such certainty that Vance couldn't be sure it wasn't true. He gathered his hat and coat, made a stiff bow that was entirely dismissive in tone, and left. When they heard his carriage depart, James turned to Eleanor. "You handled that remarkably well." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but I've learned that sometimes the best defense is to appear more certain than you feel. Show weakness, and people like that exploit it. Show strength, even if it's only partially real, and they usually back down." "You're extraordinary," James said quietly. "I keep thinking you can't surprise me anymore, and then you do." Eleanor moved to the window and watched Vance's carriage disappear down the drive toward town. "My mother will likely be furious. She'll probably write threatening letters, spread lies, attempt to damage my reputation. She may even try to convince my sisters to cut me off." "And?" James prompted. "And I've accepted that," Eleanor said. "The alternative was to spend my life bending to her will, pretending to be something I'm not, accepting her version of what I should be. I did that for 30 years. I won't do it anymore." James crossed to her and took her hands. This time, Eleanor didn't pull away. "I know you said you needed time to understand what you want," he said carefully. "I know you're afraid of being defined by a man's needs again. But I want you to know that I'm not asking you to bend or pretend. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something with me, not for convenience, not for the contract, but because we actually want each other, because we make each other better. Because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I've fallen completely in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught. This was the moment she'd been both dreading and anticipating since that day at the well. "James," she said, slowly, "I came here running. I came here because I couldn't be who my mother wanted me to be, and I couldn't marry the men she selected for me. I came here to escape, not to build." "And now?" he asked. "And now," Eleanor said, "I'm not running anymore, but I need to be clear about something. When my 5-year contract is finished, if I choose to leave, I will leave. I will take the money you pay me. I will use my skills to build a life of my own, and I will be happy. I will not stay because I'm obligated or because I'm afraid of being alone. I will only stay if I genuinely want to." "I understand," James said. "And I'm asking you to stay because you want to." Eleanor looked up at him. This man who'd bid Ein's dollar for a cursed woman, who'd given her authority and respect, who'd supported her when she stood against her own family, who'd listened when she had ideas, who'd treated her like a partner instead of a possession. "I don't know yet," she said finally, "but I'm willing to find out. I'm willing to see what this might become if we're not operating under the constraints of the original arrangement. I'm willing to let myself feel whatever I'm feeling without immediately fighting it." James pulled her close and kissed her not tentatively, but with certainty and depth. It was a kiss that spoke of months of carefully controlled attraction suddenly released. When they broke apart, Eleanor felt unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with physical balance. "We should take this slowly," she said, trying to re-establish some sense of control over the situation. "We will," James agreed. "But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I'm not letting you go. Not now. Not in 5 years unless you genuinely want to leave. But I'm also not going to pressure you or demand anything. You get to decide. Always." Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the solidity of him. For the first time since Clearwater, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just about survival or independence. A future that included joy, partnership, and the possibility of a man who actually loved her for who she was. The letter from her mother arrived 5 days later. It was brief and vicious, accusing Eleanor of betrayal, ingratitude, and damaging the family reputation. It ended with the statement, "You are no longer welcome in Clearwater. Do not contact me or your sisters again." Eleanor read it once, then handed it to James. "She's cut me off," she said. "I expected anger, but not this complete severance." "Does it hurt?" James asked. Eleanor considered the question honestly. Yes, she said, but not as much as it would have a year ago. And I can live with this pain because the alternative was a lifetime of living according to someone else's design. James took the letter and threw it into the fireplace, where it caught flame and burned away to ash. "Welcome to freedom," he said. 6 weeks after Edward Vance's departure, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She noticed the signs gradually: at first unusual fatigue, a sudden aversion to certain foods, nausea in the early mornings. It took her 3 weeks to accept what her body was telling her. Then she spent another week deciding whether to tell James. She found him in the study on a Thursday evening, reviewing cattle tallies with Calvin. "Calvin," she said, "could you give us a moment?" Calvin looked between them, read something in Eleanor's face, and excused himself without comment. Once they were alone, Eleanor sat down across from James. "I'm pregnant," she said without preamble. "About 8 weeks along, I believe. I wanted you to know." James's expression went through several transformations: shock, joy, concern, and something else she couldn't quite read. Finally, he stood and came around the desk to kneel in front of her chair. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Do you need anything? Have you seen a doctor?" "I'm fine," Eleanor said. "But, James, we need to talk about what this means." "It means we're going to be a family," James said simply. "No," Eleanor said, and the word came out harder than she intended. "It means I'm going to be a mother. And we need to discuss whether that's something I actually want or something that's just happening to me because I didn't think carefully enough about the consequences of our intimacy." James sat back, absorbing this. "You don't want the child?" "I don't know what I want," Eleanor said, and she could hear the frustration in her own voice. "I came here because I was told my entire life that a woman's only value was in bearing children. I was rejected by 5 men because I couldn't, or I thought I couldn't do that. And the moment I finally allow myself to be with a man who loves me for my mind and my competence, I become pregnant. Do you see the irony?" "Yes," James said quietly, "I do. But Eleanor, you're not being forced to have this child. If you don't want to carry it to term, there are options. It's not safe and it's not legal, but there are women who know how to help. I won't force you into motherhood." Eleanor's anger deflated slightly. This was one of the reasons she'd fallen in love with him, his willingness to give her actual choice, even when it was difficult. "I don't know if I want to terminate the pregnancy," she said. "But I need to know that I have that option without judgment. I need to know that if I decide I can't do this, you won't see it as a betrayal." "I won't," James said firmly. "This is your body, your decision. I'm here to support whatever you choose." "But Eleanor, can I tell you what I'm hoping?" Eleanor nodded. "I'm hoping you'll have this child," James said. "Not because society expects you to, not because you owe me an heir, but because I think you would be an extraordinary mother, the kind who teaches a child to think for themselves, to value their own integrity, to stand up for what they believe in. I think our child would be lucky to have you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "That's not fair. You can't say things like that." "Why not?" James asked. "Because it makes it harder to think clearly," Eleanor said. "I need to make this decision based on what I want, not on what would make you happy or what would fulfill some narrative about redemption." "Then make it based on what you want," James said. "Not what you think you should want, not what's expected. Truly, honestly, what do you want?" Eleanor was quiet for a long time. She thought about her 5 failed engagements, about the years of being told she was broken, about the shame that had driven her to an auction block. She thought about the unexpected strength she'd found here, the capability, the partnership. "I want to know who I am without being defined by motherhood or lack of it," she said finally. "I want to prove that I can be important because of who I am, not because of who I produce." "Then we'll wait," James said. "We'll let you. carry this pregnancy, and you'll give birth, and you'll discover who you are as a mother. And when you do, I think you'll find that it doesn't define you, it adds to you." Over the following weeks, Eleanor adjusted to the reality of her pregnancy. She experienced nausea and fatigue, food cravings and strange physical sensations she'd never anticipated. Samuel, in the kitchen, became adept at preparing foods that appeased her shifting preferences. Mrs. Grace quietly began preparing the house for a baby cleaning and organizing the spare room that would become the nursery, suggesting practical preparations without pushing. But more challenging than the physical changes was the emotional shift that began to happen within Eleanor. She'd spent so much of her life not wanting motherhood that she hadn't actually examined what wanting it might feel like. As her belly swelled and she began to feel the child moving inside her, something shifted in how she thought about her future. She started reading books about child development and education. She made notes about the kind of lessons she wanted to teach a child: critical thinking, self-respect, the importance of personal integrity. She imagined conversations with a daughter about why she should never settle for less than she deserved, or with a son about respecting women as equals and partners. It was during this period of mental preparation that the crisis came. A rider arrived at the Circle M on a cold November afternoon with a letter from Calvin's brother, who lived in Fort Worth. The letter contained news that would change everything. James called Eleanor into the study after reading it. She could see the tension in his jaw, the careful way he was controlling his expression. "There's a problem," he said without preamble, "with the well project." "What kind of problem?" Eleanor asked, fear already rising in her throat. "The drilling company we hired, the one that did our wells, they've gone bankrupt. The owner, a man named Harold Jenkins, has been accused of fraud. Apparently, he was taking contracts, collecting down payments, and then doing substandard work while keeping most of the money. Several ranchers across Texas are claiming they paid for wells that don't produce adequate water or don't produce water at all." "What does that have to do with us?" Eleanor asked. "Our wells work. We paid for them and received what we paid for." "That's not what's being claimed," James said grimly. He handed her a document. "There's a lawsuit being filed against all of Jenkins' clients. Some ranchers who had wells fail are claiming conspiracy, that we got good wells while they got bad wells, that there was collusion, that the costs to fix their failed wells should be distributed among all of Jenkins' clients as shared liability." Eleanor read the document carefully, her mind working through the implications. "That's absurd. We can't be held liable for their poor wells. We didn't cause their failures." "I know," James said, "but the lawsuit has already been filed. We have to respond. We have to defend ourselves in court. And Eleanor, if we lose, we could be ordered to pay restitution to the affected ranchers. We could be ordered to fund the drilling of new wells or the repairs of failed ones. It could cost us tens of thousands of dollars." Eleanor felt the child move inside her, a flutter of life that reminded her what was at stake. "We need a lawyer." "I've already sent word to Fort Worth," James said. "There's a man named Harrison Prescott who specializes in land and water rights disputes. He's expensive, but he's good. I've asked him to come to the ranch next week to review the situation." Eleanor stood and began to pace, her mind racing. "We have documentation of everything we paid, everything we received. We have the drilling company's own assessments of our well productivity. We have proof that our wells work and produce adequate water. We have correspondence where Jenkins recommended our drilling depths based on his professional assessment. We have testimony from the ranch hands about the drought and how our wells performed." "We have all of that," James agreed. "But we also need to address the ranchers' claims. We need to understand their side of the situation, understand what they're alleging specifically, understand what evidence they have. Then we get that information," Eleanor said. "We reach out to each of the affected ranchers. We find out exactly what happened with their wells, what they paid, what they received, where the failures occurred. We build a comprehensive understanding of Jenkins' operations so we can demonstrate that we weren't part of any conspiracy. James watched her with an expression of mingled love and concern. Eleanor, you're pregnant. You should be resting, not taking on a legal defense strategy. I'm pregnant, not incapacitated, Eleanor said sharply. And this affects our child's future. I'm not going to sit idle while someone tries to destroy what we've built. Besides, a pregnancy doesn't slow down my thinking. If anything, it sharpens it. I have more reason to care about the outcome. When Harrison Prescott arrived the following week, he was not what Eleanor expected. She'd anticipated someone older, more traditional, less likely to take a woman's input seriously. Instead, she found herself facing a man in his mid-50s with sharp intelligence in his eyes and a willingness to listen to Eleanor's analysis of the situation. Most of my clients try to hide behind their lawyers, Prescott said, reviewing Eleanor's compiled documentation. They hand everything over and hope for the best. You've actually done the work of understanding your own case. That's unusual. I have experience managing complex situations, Eleanor said simply. Over the course of 3 days, Prescott, Eleanor, and James built a comprehensive defense strategy. Eleanor had identified patterns in Jenkins's operations. He'd used substandard drilling techniques in some cases, had taken shortcuts on geological surveys in others, had misrepresented soil composition in his reports. Most importantly, Eleanor had traced Jenkins' equipment movements and documented that he'd used different teams for different jobs, suggesting the quality issues were about his operations overall, not a conspiracy to favor certain clients. If we can prove Jenkins' business model was fundamentally fraudulent from the start, Prescott said, then we can argue that our success wasn't favoritism or conspiracy, but rather superior conditions in our location and careful decision-making about drilling depths. We can also argue that we have no responsibility for other ranchers' decisions regarding their drilling operations. There's another angle, Eleanor said, and both men turned to look at her. Jenkins' bankruptcy. If his company is bankrupt, then he's liable for damages to his clients. The affected ranchers should be pursuing him directly, not spreading the liability among his clients. That's not just, and I suspect the court will see it that way. Prescott smiled. You should have been a lawyer, Mrs. Mitchell. I was too busy learning to survive, Eleanor said dryly. The lawsuit dragged on through the winter and into early spring. There were depositions and document reviews, arguments and counter-arguments. Eleanor attended every single hearing, despite her advancing pregnancy and James's concerns about the stress and physical strain. She was 8 months pregnant when the ruling came down. The judge dismissed the lawsuit against the Circle M, finding that the ranchers had no legal basis to claim the ranch was part of Jenkins' conspiracy. He did order Jenkins' remaining assets, which amounted to very little, distributed among the affected ranchers, but the Circle M was cleared of any liability. Eleanor received the news while sitting in the library. James brought her the letter personally, arriving earlier than expected to be with her when she read it. We won, he said simply. Eleanor set down the letter and looked at her hands, resting over her swollen belly. We won because I didn't accept that this wasn't my problem. Because I insisted on understanding every detail, every angle, every implication. You won because you're brilliant, James said. I won because I refused to be sidelined, Eleanor corrected. Because I understood that being pregnant doesn't diminish my capability to think or contribute. Because I've learned that my value isn't about what I can produce, whether that's children or business outcomes. It's about who I am and what I choose to do with my mind and my energy. James pulled her into an embrace, and Eleanor felt the child move between them, a small reminder of what was coming, of the new chapter they were about to enter. You're going to be an incredible mother, James said. But more importantly, you're going to be yourself while being a mother. That's rare. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder. She'd come to the Circle M, running from a definition she'd rejected. She was leaving behind the woman who'd stood on an auction block, willing to be bought because she had nowhere else to go. The woman she was becoming was something entirely different. She was a partner, a strategist, a woman who'd learned that independence and connection weren't opposites. They could coexist, they could strengthen each other. And in a few weeks, she would discover who she was as a mother. Eleanor's labor began on a Tuesday morning in late April, 3 days before the baby was due. The pains came gradually at first, a tightening in her abdomen that she almost mistook for indigestion. By noon, she recognized what was happening. She was washing linens when the contractions intensified. Mrs. Grace immediately took control, sending a ranch hand to fetch the midwife from the nearest town, a woman named Margaret Chen, who delivered half the babies in West Texas and had a reputation for competence and compassion. James wanted to stay by Eleanor's side, but she sent him out firmly. "You'll make me anxious," she said between contractions. "I need to focus. Go check on the cattle. I'll send for you when the baby comes." Labor lasted 18 hours. It was harder than Eleanor had anticipated. The pain was constant, relentless, demanding her complete attention and surrender to forces beyond her control. It was humbling. After a year of being in control, making decisions, strategizing solutions, Eleanor was forced to simply endure. But she didn't complain. She worked with Margaret Chen, followed instructions, and breathed through the pain because there was nothing else to do but move forward through it. Her daughter was born at 2 in the morning, arriving into the world with a sound that Eleanor would later describe as a warrior's cry rather than an infant's whimper. The baby was small but robust, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in the room with surprising awareness. "A girl," Margaret Chen said, handing the child to Eleanor after cleaning her. "And healthy, well done." Eleanor looked down at this tiny human who was part her and part James, who had her dark coloring and his strong features, and felt something shift fundamentally inside her chest. It wasn't overwhelming love that came later, in quiet moments. What she felt in that first moment was responsibility and wonder and a strange, fierce clarity. This was her daughter. This was what she'd been afraid of all her life, not motherhood itself, but becoming someone's everything, being defined by her ability to nurture and create and sustain life. But looking at her daughter, Eleanor realized something her younger self hadn't understood. Being someone's mother didn't have to diminish her. It could expand her. She could be a mother and a strategist, a mother and a woman of capability, a mother and a person with her own thoughts and ambitions. "What will you name her?" Margaret asked. Eleanor looked at James, who'd been allowed back in the moment the baby was delivered and was now standing beside the bed with an expression of such tender awe that Eleanor almost didn't recognize him. "Catherine," Eleanor said, "after James's first wife. The woman who built this family, who taught us how to see children as individuals, who believed in education and seeing people for who they actually are. I want our daughter to carry some of that forward." James made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He reached down and gently touched his daughter's face, and Eleanor saw tears on his cheeks. "She'd have wanted that," he said. The weeks following Catherine's birth were nothing like Eleanor expected. She'd anticipated motherhood would feel limiting, would pull her away from her intellectual work, would demand she become someone nurturing and soft and fundamentally different from who she'd been. Instead, she discovered she could be both. She could feed Catherine and think about the summer grazing rotation. She could rock the baby to sleep while mentally reviewing household accounts. She could be fully present with her daughter and still maintain the other parts of herself that mattered. Samuel began bringing her meals in the nursery, hearty food that was easy to eat one-handed. Mrs. Grace handled the major household operations, checking in with Eleanor for decisions but taking responsibility for execution. James managed the ranch operations and deliberately kept problematic decisions away from Eleanor during the early weeks, recognizing she needed time to adjust. But Eleanor grew restless. By the 4th week, she was making notes about how to improve the nursery organization. By the 6th week, she was asking James questions about ranch operations again. By the 8th week, she was back in the study for a few hours each day, reviewing accounts while Catherine napped. It was during one of these sessions that James found her looking troubled, staring at the books spread across the desk. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Something's off with the cattle inventory," Eleanor said, not looking up. "These numbers don't match what Calvin reported last month. Either we had an unexpected culling, or someone's numbers are wrong." James pulled up a chair. "Could be a recording error." "Could be," Eleanor agreed. "But I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels off. Something's definitely off." She spent the rest of the day tracking down the discrepancy. By evening, she'd identified the problem. 3 cattle had been sold without proper documentation, and the money hadn't been recorded in the accounts. It was a small amount, less than $900, but it indicated a theft, a breach of trust. Eleanor brought her findings to James that night after Catherine was asleep. "I think it's Robert," she said carefully. "Not necessarily that he stole the cattle himself, but he's the head of operations. And the sale happened during his watch. The cattle were sold to a man named Peter Holbrook, who I believe was in town 2 weeks ago." James looked troubled. "Robert's been with me for 7 years. He's been loyal." "Loyalty and theft aren't incompatible," Eleanor said. "People steal for reasons. We need to understand what his reason was before we decide what to do about it." "We?" James asked. "This affects the ranch, which means it affects our future," Eleanor said. "I'm a partner in this operation. I need to be involved in these decisions." The next morning, James called Robert into the study with Eleanor present. The rancher's face went pale when James showed him the discrepancy. "I can explain," Robert said immediately. "Then explain," Eleanor said, her voice neutral. Robert sank into a chair. "My daughter is sick, real sick. The doctors in Fort Worth say she needs surgery that's expensive. Her mother, my ex-wife, she can't pay for it. I was doing extra work on the side, and I found a buyer for some of the older cattle that I thought weren't being properly tracked. I was going to pay back the money once I had it." "You stole from us to pay for your daughter's medical care," Eleanor said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "I did," Robert said, "and I regret it. But I don't regret trying to save my daughter's life." James looked at Eleanor. She could see he was torn between loyalty and the breach of trust. "How much did you get for the cattle?" Eleanor asked. $85, Robert said quietly. "And your daughter's surgery costs?" $600. Maybe more, depending on what the doctor finds. Eleanor looked at James. She could see him wanting to offer Robert money, wanting to fix this problem. But that wasn't what this situation called for. "Robert," she said, "you violated our trust. You stole from us. Those are serious things that damage the foundation of this operation. But you did it for a reason that makes sense to save your daughter's life. I respect that reason, even though I don't respect the method." "What are you saying?" Robert asked. "I'm saying," Eleanor continued, "that we're going to help you pay for your daughter's surgery. Not as restitution for what you stole, but as an investment in someone who works for this ranch. You're going to work here for another 5 years, and during that time, you'll repay us $150 per year. That covers the surgery cost with interest. And you're never going to steal from us again." "Eleanor," James started, but she held up a hand. "This is my decision as part of the household and ranch management," she said. "Robert is a valuable employee who made a mistake for an understandable reason. We can either destroy him by pursuing legal consequences, or we can help him and keep a good man working for us. I choose the second option." Robert looked at Eleanor with an expression of profound relief. "I don't know how to thank you." "You thank me by being honest in the future," Eleanor said, "and by understanding that if something like this happens again, we won't be merciful. We'll treat it as a serious crime. But one mistake Born of genuine need, I can forgive. After Robert left, James pulled Eleanor close. You're going to be a remarkable woman for people to work for, you know that. I'm trying to be the woman my mother wasn't, Eleanor said. The kind who understands that people are complicated, that circumstances matter, that mercy can coexist with accountability. Catherine, the first Catherine, understood that. She saw people as individuals with their own challenges. I want to honor that. The incident with Robert became known among the ranch hands within days, as such things always do. Eleanor noticed the atmosphere around the ranch shift slightly. The hands worked harder, were more respectful, treated her with a regard that went beyond her position as the owner's wife. She'd made a decision that demonstrated both strength and compassion, and they respected her for it. But the real challenge came 3 months after Catherine's birth, when Eleanor realized she was pregnant again. She discovered it the way she had with Catherine's sudden aversion to food, unusual fatigue, the subtle physical signs her body was sending. She was shocked. They'd been careful, had used methods to prevent pregnancy, but apparently not carefully enough. She told James immediately, finding him in the barn, checking on a sick calf. I'm pregnant again, she said, without preamble. James straightened, processing the information. Are you all right? Is the baby all right? We're both fine, Eleanor said. But James, I just gave birth 3 months ago. My body is still recovering. I have a 3-month-old daughter who demands constant attention. We have business operations to manage. Another pregnancy right now is complicated. Do you want to terminate? James asked, the question coming easily because he'd already established that he respected her autonomy on this matter. Eleanor considered the question honestly. I don't know. Part of me wants to focus on Catherine for a while, establish myself as a mother before I do it again. Part of me thinks being older, having a larger gap between children, might not be better. I'm genuinely uncertain. Then we have time to figure it out, James said. You don't have to decide this week or this month. But Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Whatever you decide, I love you. If you have this child, I love you. If you don't have this child, I love you. Your value isn't measured in how many babies you produce. Eleanor felt something release in her that she hadn't realized was tight. She'd spent so much of her life having her worth measured by her capacity to bear children, first as someone who couldn't, then as someone who was supposed to prove her value through motherhood. Having James reaffirm that his love wasn't contingent on her reproductive capacity was profoundly freeing. Give me a few weeks, she said. I'll think about it. I'll talk to Margaret Chen about the risks of having 2 pregnancies so close together. I'll listen to my own instincts about what I want, and then I'll decide. Over the next month, Eleanor did exactly that. She spoke with Margaret Chen, who confirmed that another pregnancy so soon would be challenging, but not impossible. She observed herself with Catherine, noting how much energy motherhood required, how deeply fulfilling it was, but also how completely it demanded her attention. She thought about her goals, about the work she'd hoped to do managing the ranch, about the identity she'd built as a strategist and decision-maker. And she thought about the younger Eleanor who'd come to the auction block, terrified that motherhood was the only thing that could make her valuable. One evening, while rocking Catherine to sleep, Eleanor made her decision. I'm going to have the baby, she told James that night. Are you certain? He asked. I'm certain because I'm choosing to have it, Eleanor said. Not because society expects it, not because I need to prove something, not because I'm afraid of what refusing means. I'm having it because I want to, because I think Catherine will be better off with siblings, because I'm capable of managing 2 children and everything else I'm doing, and because I've finally learned that motherhood doesn't diminish me, it's just one part of who I am. James kissed her forehead. Welcome to the woman you've always been becoming. The second pregnancy was harder than the first. Eleanor carried the child low and uncomfortable, struggling with nausea well into the 4th month. Catherine, now crawling and increasingly mobile, demanded constant attention that Eleanor struggled to provide while dealing with physical exhaustion and the complications of carrying another child. By the 6th month, Eleanor had made the difficult decision to step back from some of her involvement in ranch operations. She maintained the household management and continued reviewing accounts, but she delegated some of the decision-making to Calvin and James, knowing her body needed rest and her attention needed to be split between her current pregnancy and her infant daughter. It was during this period of reduced involvement that the problem emerged. James came to her in the library one evening, with papers spread across his arms and an expression of barely controlled fury. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "A serious one." Eleanor set down her book immediately, recognizing the tone. "What kind of situation?" "The northern pasture boundaries," James said, spreading out survey maps across the table. "There's a man named Theodore Garrett who owns property adjoining ours. He's been incrementally moving his fence line east, claiming our land as his own. Slowly enough that nobody noticed for months, but by my calculation, he's taken nearly 200 acres. Eleanor studied the maps carefully. "Is there a legal survey showing our original boundaries?" "Yes, but it's from 1882. Garrett claims the survey was inaccurate, that his family's original homestead claim actually extends further east than the 1882 survey indicated. He's filed a counterclaim with the Territorial Land Office." "How much of the 200 acres is usable?" Eleanor asked. "Most of it," James said grimly. "Good grazing land, a water source that feeds into our creek system. We can't afford to lose it." Eleanor leaned back, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly where the baby moved restlessly. This was the kind of problem she'd solved before the well project, the lawsuit. But she was pregnant, exhausted, and increasingly aware of her limitations. "We need to consult with a lawyer," she said, "someone who specializes in land disputes. We need to understand the strength of Garrett's claim and our options for responding." "Harrison Prescott is already on his way," James said. "But Eleanor, this is different from the Jenkins lawsuit. This is an active, ongoing theft of our property. Garrett isn't hiding what he's doing. He's just hoping we won't challenge him. Then we challenge him," Eleanor said. "But carefully. We don't rush into this. We understand every aspect of the situation before we commit to a course of action." Harrison Prescott arrived 3 days later. He was less optimistic about their position than he had been regarding the Jenkins lawsuit. "The 1882 survey is solid," he told them, spreading out documents across the study table. "But Garrett's argument isn't without merit. The surveying techniques of 1882 were less precise than modern methods. There's a legitimate argument that the boundary markers were placed incorrectly. It's going to come down to what evidence we can present and what Garrett can present." "What do we need?" Eleanor asked, even though she could barely keep her eyes open. The exhaustion of pregnancy, combined with the stress of this threat, was overwhelming. "We need to prove continuous use and occupancy of the disputed land," Prescott said. "We need to show that the Circle M has been using that land for grazing, that we've maintained it, that we've treated it as our property in every way. We need historical records receipts for improvements, livestock records showing cattle grazing in that section, anything that demonstrates we've been treating it as ours for the past 20 years. James looked at Eleanor. "You maintain those records better than anyone else I've ever worked with." "Do you think they exist?" Eleanor considered. She'd reorganized the household records when she first arrived, but she hadn't gone through all the historical ranch documentation. That had been scattered in various places, some with James, some with Calvin, some probably lost entirely. "We need to search," she said. "We need to go through every record we have from the past 20 years and find anything that proves we were using that land. I'll coordinate it, but I need help." We don't have time for this to be done casually. Eleanor, you're 5 months pregnant, James said. You shouldn't be doing this level of work. And we shouldn't lose 200 acres of productive land, Eleanor countered. I can organize a search and review of records. That's primarily mental work. I'll sit while I do it. It won't tax me more than reviewing household accounts already does. She was being optimistic about her ability to manage the task, and she knew it. But Eleanor had learned something important over the past year. Sometimes you had to push yourself beyond what felt comfortable to protect what mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor coordinated an extensive search through the Circle M's records. She brought in Mrs. Grace and Samuel to help organize documents. She had James locate old receipts and accounts books. She instructed Calvin to provide livestock records going back as far as they existed. Then she began the painstaking process of reviewing everything, marking relevant documents, organizing them chronologically, and building a narrative from the records that proved the Circle M's continuous use and occupancy of the disputed land. It was during this process that Eleanor found something unexpected. A deed from 1879 tucked in an old ledger that James had thought was purely household accounting. The deed explicitly mentioned the northern boundary of the Circle M property and described specific landmarks: a distinctive boulder formation, a particular curve in the creek, a cluster of unusual trees. Eleanor showed it to Harrison Prescott when he came to review her compiled evidence. "This is excellent," Prescott said, examining the deed carefully. "This 1879 deed predates Garrett's counterclaim and explicitly establishes the boundary. Combined with all the livestock records showing cattle in this section, the improvement receipts for water systems, the tax assessments on this acreage, we have a strong case." "Strong enough to win?" Eleanor asked. "Strong enough that Garrett will likely drop his claim if presented with this evidence," Prescott said. "Nobody wants to waste time and money litigating a case they're going to lose. We just need to show him we're serious, and we have the documentation to back up our claim." Eleanor sent Prescott to Garrett with the compiled evidence and a formal notice that the Circle M was prepared to defend its 19-territorial claim, legally if necessary. 3 days later, Garrett withdrew his counterclaim and removed his fence to the correct boundary line. It should have been a victory. Eleanor had solved another problem through research and strategic thinking, but she didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted in a way that went beyond normal pregnancy fatigue. That evening, she collapsed. Not dramatically, she simply sat down while making dinner preparations and couldn't make herself stand up again. James found her in the kitchen, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she said, her voice hollow. "I can't keep doing this." James knelt in front of her. "What can't you do?" "All of it," Eleanor said, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen, around the ranch, around the entirety of the life she'd built. "I can't be a wife and a mother and a business partner and a decision-maker and a pregnant woman all at the same time. Something has to give, and I don't know which something it should be." "Then we'll figure it out together," James said. He helped her to her feet and guided her to the parlor, where he settled her on the sofa with her feet elevated. "You've been carrying too much, both literally and figuratively." "I came here to prove I wasn't broken," Eleanor said, and the words came out broken themselves. "I came here to prove I could be valuable, and I'm exhausted. I'm managing, but I'm exhausted, and I'm afraid I'm going to fail at something important." "You won't fail," James said quietly. "But, Eleanor, you need to understand something. You've already proven what you needed to prove. You're not broken. You're incredibly valuable. But you're also human, and human beings have limits." "What are my limits?" Eleanor asked bitterly. "Because I don't seem to know where they are. Your limit right now is that you're pregnant, you're exhausted, and you need to rest," James said firmly. "And I'm going to make sure that happens with or without your cooperation. Over the next week, James systematically reduced Eleanor's workload. Samuel took over most of the meal planning, checking with Eleanor for preferences rather than having her direct operations. Mrs. Grace managed the household budget. Calvin handled routine ranch decisions. Harrison Prescott handled the formal conclusion of the boundary dispute. Eleanor found herself with time to rest, to sit with Catherine, to read, to simply exist without demanding something of herself. It was uncomfortable. The part of Eleanor that had defined herself through capability and productivity chafed against the inactivity. But underneath the discomfort was a growing realization. She didn't have to be everything all the time. She could delegate. She could trust others. She could rest. By the 8th month of her second pregnancy, Eleanor had made peace with her limitations. She was still involved in household operations and ranch decisions, but she was no longer trying to carry the entire weight of the operation. She was pregnant. She was also a mother. These things were enough to occupy her attention. Catherine, now 11 months old, was crawling everywhere and showing signs of an intelligence and determination that reminded Eleanor painfully of herself. She was a stubborn baby, opinionated about what she wanted, unwilling to be pacified with substitutes. Eleanor watched her daughter and saw a woman in formation, a woman who would have to learn to navigate a world that didn't respect stubbornness in women. One afternoon, Eleanor was sitting with Catherine in the library, watching the child examine a book with intense focus despite being unable to read when James found them. "Come for a ride with me," he said. "I'm 9 months pregnant and exhausted," Eleanor said. "Riding is not happening." "A short ride," James said, "on the quiet horse. Trust me." Something in his expression told her not to argue. She allowed him to help her onto a gentle mare, and they rode slowly out toward the northern boundary where the dispute with Garrett had been. The boundary markers were clearly visible now. James had made sure of it. The landscape opened up before them, vast and golden in the late afternoon light. "This is ours," James said simply. "All of it, because you fought for it." "I did my job," Eleanor said. "It's what I was brought here to do." "No," James said. "You were brought here to manage a household and be a wife. Everything else you've done, the wells, the business decisions, the legal defense, the difference, boundary dispute you've done, because you're brilliant and capable, and because you refuse to accept limits on what you could contribute." Eleanor looked out at the land she'd helped save from drought, the land she'd defended in court, the land where her daughter was being raised. "I used to think I needed to do all of this to prove I wasn't broken," she said quietly. "I thought I had to be extraordinary to be worthy, but I'm learning that I'm worthy just because I exist. That being capable is good, but being human with limits and needs and the right to rest is equally important." "Yes," James said. "That's the thing your mother never taught you, but Catherine did through her example, and now you're teaching your daughter." Eleanor placed her hand on her swollen belly, where the baby was moving. This child would be born into a different world than Eleanor had known. This child would have a mother who'd chosen her deliberately and completely, who could teach her that capability and rest were not opposites, that being worthy wasn't something you had to prove. "Let's go home," Eleanor said. "I need to rest, and then I need to write a letter." "To whom?" James asked. "To my sisters," Eleanor said. "The ones in Clearwater who my mother told to cut me off. I want them to know that I've built a life here, that I'm happy, that they're welcome to visit or correspond if they want to, and that I've finally learned to forgive myself for not being the woman my mother wanted me to be." Eleanor's second son was born on a cold November evening, arriving with significantly less drama than his sister had. Margaret Chen, who delivered Catherine a year and a half earlier, predicted an easy birth based on Eleanor's physical signs, and she was right. The labor lasted 9 hours, and the baby emerged healthy and robust, with James's strong features and Eleanor's dark eyes. Another determined one, Margaret said, handing the child to Eleanor after. Cleaning him. Look at how he's gripping your finger. He knows what he wants. Eleanor named him Thomas, after her father, the man she barely remembered, but whose laugh she'd never forgotten. James accepted the choice without question, understanding that Eleanor was building her own legacy, now one that honored her past, while creating something entirely new. Thomas's birth marked a transition point. Eleanor was no longer a woman newly arrived at the Circle M, proving herself through capability and strategy. She was a woman 5 years into a marriage that had transformed her completely, with 2 children born of genuine partnership, with a life so thoroughly integrated into this land and these people that leaving had become unthinkable, which brought her to the decision she'd been contemplating for months. On the day of her 5-year anniversary at the Circle M, exactly 5 years to the day from when James had bid $1 for her on an auction block in Clearwater, Eleanor asked to speak with him privately. They sat in the study, the same room where they'd first discussed the terms of their arrangement. James looked nervous, and Eleanor realized he was worried about what she might say. 5 years ago, Eleanor began. You paid $1 for a contract with a woman you'd never met. We agreed to 5 years of marriage, partnership, and mutual respect. The contract expires today. James's jaw tightened slightly. I want to renegotiate, Eleanor continued. I want to tear up the original contract entirely. No more 5-year terms. No more temporary arrangements. I want to marry you permanently, legally, completely. Not because you bought me, not because society expects it, but because I choose you. Every single day, I choose you. James exhaled, and Eleanor realized he'd been holding his breath. Is that a yes to staying? He asked. It's more than that, Eleanor said. It's me telling you that the woman who arrived here terrified and broken is not the same woman who stands here now. The woman I've become doesn't run. She doesn't hide. She doesn't accept half measures. She accepts full partnership with someone who respects her mind, her capability, and her right to be exactly who she is. That's you. That will always be you. James pulled her into an embrace, and Eleanor felt him shaking with relief, with joy, with the same kind of overwhelming emotion that sometimes caught her unaware when she looked at their children. I was so afraid you'd leave, he said quietly. I almost did, Eleanor admitted. There were days in the second pregnancy when I wanted to prove I didn't need this, didn't need you, didn't need to be here. But that was fear talking, the same fear that made me reject 5 men in Clearwater. The difference is, I didn't reject you, because you never asked me to be anything except myself. The celebration that evening was quiet, just family and a few close people from the ranch. Samuel made Eleanor's favorite meal, Mrs. Grace, brought a small cake. Calvin came in from the pastures to acknowledge the occasion. Robert brought his daughter, a girl recovering beautifully from her surgery, to share in the moment. Eleanor stood in the kitchen watching these people who'd become her family through years of shared work and mutual respect, and felt the final piece of her old life fall away. She was no longer Eleanor Hartwell from Philadelphia. She was no longer the cursed woman rejected by 5 men. She was Eleanor Mitchell, wife of James, mother of Catherine and Thomas, partner in building something that would outlast all of them. The following months brought changes. Eleanor officially took her place as James's equal partner in all major ranch decisions. She began implementing long-term improvements she'd been planning, expanding the library, establishing a small school on the property for the ranch children, creating a comprehensive record-keeping system that would serve the Circle M for decades. She also began writing. It started as a project to document the history of the Circle M for their children, the story of how she and James had come together, how they'd survived the drought, how they'd built a thriving operation from years of hard work. But as she wrote, Eleanor realized she was creating something more than a family history. She was creating a record of what was possible when a woman refused to accept someone else's definition of her worth. She wrote about the auction block with unflinching honesty, acknowledging that she'd been in a desperate position, but also that the desperation had been imposed by a society that measured women's value too narrowly. She wrote about the Wells Project and how her perspective had been valuable, not despite being a woman, but because she brought a different way of thinking to the problem. She wrote about the moment she'd broken down during her second pregnancy and how crucial it had been to learn that accepting limitations wasn't failure, it was wisdom. By the following spring, when Catherine was 3 years old and Thomas was a robust toddler, Eleanor had filled an entire journal with her reflections. James found her in the library one evening, adding the final pages. "What are you writing?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "A letter to our daughter," Eleanor said. "A letter she can read when she's old enough to understand it. A letter explaining why she was born into a world different from the one I grew up in and what I hope she does with that difference." "What do you hope she does with it?" James asked. Eleanor set down her pen. "I hope she's ambitious without apology. I hope she's picky about who she trusts and who she loves. I hope she understands that a woman's worth isn't tied to her ability to bear children or serve a man. I hope she builds something of her own, whether that's a business, a family, a community, a life of solitude. I hope she makes her own choices and lives with the consequences of those choices, fully aware that she made them. I hope she never stands on an auction block, literal or figurative, and accepts someone else's assessment of her value." "And for Thomas?" James asked. "I hope he learns to respect women as equals," Eleanor said. "I hope he understands that the strongest women aren't those who sacrifice themselves for men, but those who build lives of their own and then choose to share that with a partner. I hope he grows up watching his mother make decisions and his father supporting those decisions and understands that's what partnership looks like." James was quiet for a moment. "You've changed everything," he said finally. "No," Eleanor said. "You changed everything by being willing to see me differently than Clearwater did. I just had the courage to accept the change." 2 years later, when Eleanor was 37 years old and had been at the Circle M for 7 years, she received a letter from one of her sisters. Her name was Margaret, and she was writing to say she'd heard rumors about Eleanor's life from a friend passing through Texas who'd encountered someone who knew someone familiar with the Circle M. The letter was tentative, carefully worded, full of questions. Margaret wanted to know if Eleanor was happy. She wanted to know if the stories she'd heard about Eleanor managing a ranch, solving business problems, standing up to a land dispute were true. She wanted to know if Eleanor had forgiven their mother. Eleanor wrote back a detailed letter telling Margaret everything. She included an invitation for Margaret and her family to visit, knowing her sister might never accept but wanting the offer to exist. She also answered the question about her mother. "I have forgiven her," Eleanor wrote. "Not because what she did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger only constrains me. I understand now that she was operating with the limitations of her own era and her own fears. She couldn't imagine a different world, so she tried to force me into the one she understood. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. I'm choosing a different path for my children. I'm teaching them that the world is larger than what we've been told it is, and that they get to decide what they do with that knowledge." Margaret accepted the invitation. She arrived in Texas in the spring with her husband and 2 children, and for 2 weeks the Circle M was full of the extended family. Eleanor had thought she'd lost forever. Margaret was fascinated by every aspect of Eleanor's life, the ranch operations, the children, the strategic way Eleanor had built her position from nothing. On the last evening of their visit, Margaret pulled Eleanor aside. "I want to understand something," Margaret said. "When you left Clearwater, you were running. Now you seem rooted. How did that happen?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I didn't realize it at the time, but I think I was running toward something, not just away from something. I was running toward a place where I could be valued for who I actually am. The rooting came when I stopped running and started building. When I chose this land, this man, this life, not because they were available or convenient, but because they were right. Were those 5 men really so terrible? Margaret asked. Or were you actually picky, like the rumors said? Eleanor laughed. I was absolutely picky. That was the whole point. I had standards, and I refused to marry a man who didn't meet them. In Clearwater, being picky was considered a character flaw in a woman, but it was actually a character strength. It was me saying, I know my own value, and I'm not settling for less. They called it cursed. I call it self-respect. After Margaret left, Eleanor felt the peace of completion. She'd lost her original family, but she'd built a new one. She'd been rejected by 5 men, but she'd found one who loved her completely. She'd come to Anne, auction block, expecting to disappear into someone's definition of wife, and she'd emerged as something she'd never imagined, a woman who knew her own worth. Years later, when Eleanor was 52 years old, she sat with James on the porch of the Circle M, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Catherine was away at university studying law, determined to use her mother's experience to help other women understand their legal rights. Thomas was managing the northern pasture, having inherited his mother's strategic mind and his father's practical knowledge. There was a grandson coming, and Eleanor found herself thinking about what wisdom she wanted to pass to the next generation. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed in Clearwater, married one of those 5 men, tried to fit into your mother's world?" Eleanor turned to look at him. After 18 years together, his face was as familiar to her as her own reflection. But she never tired of looking at it. "Not for a single moment," she said. That Eleanor would have spent her life apologizing for who she was. She would have had children but never felt truly seen. She would have managed a household but never managed her own life. That Eleanor would have been safe and miserable. And this Eleanor, James asked. "This Eleanor is free," Eleanor said simply, "and freedom is worth more than all the safety and approval in the world." They sat together as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged overhead, 2 people who'd met by chance and choice and had built a life that neither could have imagined alone. The Circle M stretched out before them, the land they'd saved from drought, the fields they'd protected from fraud, the home they'd built for their children and their children's children. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, wild and free, unbounded by the expectations of civilization. Eleanor had always loved that sound. It reminded her that there were still places in the world where creatures could be exactly what they were without apology. She'd learned to be like those coyotes. Not because she didn't care about others, but because she'd finally understood that respecting herself was more important than seeking approval from a world that would never approve of who she actually was. The cursed woman rejected by 5 men had become something far more valuable than any man could have bought. She'd become herself. 20 years later, Eleanor's grandson, named James, after both his grandfather and the family legacy, would study the journals his grandmother had written. He would read about the woman who'd stepped off a stage in Clearwater, Texas, terrified and broken, and trace the arc of her transformation into someone whole. He would share those journals with his own children, telling them the story of how a woman who'd been told she was cursed learned that she was simply picky about what kind of life she wanted, picky about who deserved her loyalty, picky about settling for anything less than truth. And he would teach his children, as his mother had been taught, that a woman's value was never measured by her ability to bear children or serve a man, or fit into the expectations of a society that feared women who knew their own worth. The Circle M would thrive for generations, built on a foundation of partnership, respect, and the radical idea that women could think, decide, strategize, and lead just as well as men. It would become known throughout Texas as a ranch managed with unusual competence and fairness, and people would whisper about how that came from the woman James Mitchell had bought on an auction block decades ago. But Eleanor would know the truth. James hadn't made her competent or fair or capable. He'd simply recognized that she already was all those things and had given her the space to become fully herself. That was the real victory, not being bought, but being seen, not being rescued, but being respected, not being saved, but being chosen. Eleanor Hartwell, Mitchell, picky, capable, determined. Eleanor had written her own story, and it was far more remarkable than anything anyone could have written for her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.